and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. We are into the third week of war in the Middle East, and while that is the focus of most headlines and news, in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba is being choked by the US, and this chokehold grows stronger and tighter with every passing hour. There are huge shortages in energy, island-wide blackouts have been reported, and things look bad. It will be a huge catastrophe if Cuba falls under the pressure of US imperialism. But there are efforts to defend and support Cuba in its hour of need. We have been fundraising, and at the time of recording, we have raised close to $19,000, American dollars, for Cuba. So, to discuss what's being done, and crucially, why the masses of the world should come to the aid of Cuba, I am joined by Comrade Julia, who's been organizing a delegation of the Partisan Defense Committee to bring material aid to Cuba. Hi, Comrade.
Hi, Masa.
Thank you for taking the time to discuss Cuba with us. The news is super overwhelmed with Iran right now, but things are looking increasingly bad for Cuba. Do you want to start by giving us a bit of a sense of what's going on the ground?
Yes, the situation in Cuba is very grave. As everybody probably knows, Cuba has been under a U.S. embargo for some decades, but the situation has got qualitatively worse since the beginning of this year, particularly because the Trump administration has been threatening any regimes that send oil supplies to Cuba with enormous tariffs, meaning that countries like Venezuela or Mexico, which were providing Cuba with oil, have stopped sending shipments, and Cuba is running out of oil, which means running out of the means to run its electrical grid. And that has consequences running from everywhere from no transport to economic life is grinding to a halt. Without electricity, you can't run a fridge, you can't preserve food, you can't run hospitals. So the situation is extremely dire, and the Trump administration has basically increased the pressure and is trying to starve the Cuban people into submission after 67 years of their revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Earlier in January, I did a podcast with our comrades from Mexico on how Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, had suspended oil shipments to Cuba under pressure from the Trump administration, because Mexico, I believe, was one of its largest providers of oil.
Yes.
So it's, allies or trading partners, whatever you want to call it, until date, they have been themselves buckling under pressure from the US. And yeah, as you said, the situation is quite grave. One thing that's been making the news in the last couple of days has been some protests that have happened. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about those.
There have been some protests, mainly in the very poor areas of Havana and a few other cities in Cuba. Those have been largely motivated by people coming out, protesting lack of electricity or access to food. However, there have also been some anti-communist, pro-US elements in those protests who, for example, a few days ago did burn down the headquarters of the Cuban Communist Party in a city called Moron in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
So that element is obviously very sinister and has to be fought against. On the other hand, in terms of the majority of Cuban people, what is mainly motivating them is sheer desperation, because it has become a struggle to survive, to find food, and be able to hold down a job or anything like that, because economic life has largely ground to a halt under the impact of the blockade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And would you be able to give us any sense of what the Cuban government itself has been doing? Has it been making appeals to the international community, the working class, or what exactly is going on there?
No, it hasn't. Its strategy has been completely the opposite of what's needed. So it is relying on conducting direct negotiations with the Trump government. The Trump government is requiring that they open their economy completely to capitalist enterprise and capitalist property relations, which the Cuban government has indicated that they're willing to do. The problem, however, is that for the Cuban gusanos in Florida, this is not sufficient. They will not stop short of regime change. That is their goal. And the Trump administration is increasingly threatening to take more direct action against Cuba. So the strategy of the Cuban government of relying on the goodwill of the Trump administration is really suicidal. What should be done is really to make an appeal to the international working class in other countries, including in Latin America, where the working classes are also under the direct blackmail of the Trump administration, and crucially, the working class in the United States itself, to come to the aid of the Cuban people and fight to defend what remains of the Cuban Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you see as the current state in terms of the masses or any other governments or regimes coming to the aid of Cuba? Like, would you say that Cuba is currently isolated? Does it have support?
I think Cuba is completely isolated. I think even a lot of governments that did previously come to the aid of Cuba by trading with it, by sending oil shipments, by sending humanitarian aid, have stopped doing so under the impact of the Trump administration blackmail. And that includes not only right-wing governments, but also left-wing governments like, as you mentioned, Sheinbaum in Mexico, or the kidnapping of Maduro and the compliance of the new Venezuelan regime with the dictates of the Trump administration means that Venezuela has stopped sending oil to Cuba. But then there's also Russia and China that are actually two countries that do have the means to stand up to the US to some extent, who aren't doing so for reasons lack of political will. Like China, for example, or Russia would be in a position to send oil to Cuba and provide a direct lifeline. And because of their military power, the US would have to think twice about taking action against them. But unfortunately, that kind of aid has not been forthcoming. And especially in the case of China, which has a communist party, this is a real betrayal because it's kind of elementary for any regime that calls itself communist to come to the aid of another country that is under the direct attack of its own imperialist enemy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think we've seen that with Russia and China, where, when it came to Maduro's kidnapping, right now with Iran, like they're conducting themselves in a way that they are not getting in the way of the US. They deeply want to uphold the current status quo and not get in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. Okay, I think the other question I had is, we've been doing a fundraising campaign internationally, but I guess what are some of the reasons for why working classes in the West should actually come to the aid of Cuba, including by donating?
Well, it's easy to make statements in support of the Cuban people, to sign statements of solidarity, or to say we're thinking of you, or to post on social media, etc. But really, the situation in Cuba right now is that if you want to solidarize with the Cuban people, what you really need to do is contribute to sending material aid. Now is the time that the need is dire and words are not enough. So this campaign is a chance to actually put your money where your mouth is and help directly support the Cuban people who are trying to survive under the jackboot of US imperialism. Now, why would workers have an interest in doing so in imperialist countries? Well, simply because the regime that is oppressing Cuba is also the regime that's oppressing them at home. So, for example, in the United States, a large proportion of the workforce is under direct threat from ICE, paramilitaries. The working class is being ground down in all imperialist countries. Many of us are suffering under austerity drives by the very same governments who are waging, not only the threats against Cuba, but the war in Iran, and God knows where else they're going next. But opposing imperialism really starts with sending concrete solidarity to the victims of imperialism in other countries. And that's one of the ways to help struggle against imperialism directly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's come to that. As I said at the outset, we have been fundraising for, I think, a couple of months now. I'm not sure. Maybe
About
less
a
than
month.
2 months.
About a month.
Yeah. And we've raised close to $19,000. Tell our listeners what that has entailed, where that will go, where that's come from.
Okay, so we've launched an appeal internationally. The Partisan Defense Committee is based here in Britain. It does have sister organizations in the United States, in other countries like France, Germany, Australia, and Canada. And so we have launched an appeal through our sister organizations for funds, an appeal which we have been distributing in among the working classes in those countries, among our own supporters. And we've had a very positive response with donations coming in from a number of countries around the world. So what we're doing actually is we are part of a much larger effort to bring aid to Cuba. We are joining the Nuestra America convoy to Cuba, which is converging from a number of different countries in the world on Havana for March 21st, this coming Saturday, bringing humanitarian aid by air, or sea, directly to Cuba. Now, that includes contributions like ours, which are very modest. It also includes, so basically what we're going to be doing is we're bringing both material aid ourselves. Material aid, that means food. We're bringing medicines. We're also bringing things like lamps and batteries to help people who have no access to electricity. But we're also contributing some of our funds to organizations that have much larger resources and are able to bring, for example, operating equipment for hospitals or solar panels to help Cuba actually have access to electricity without having access to oil. Solar panels is something that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one initiative that we are donating to, which actually was launched by the PSL in the United States, which is bringing solar panels and generators to Cuban hospitals, and they have an export license already in place to bring that equipment. Here in Britain, we're contributing some of the funds to an organization called Cuba Vive, which is a British-based organization that was founded by Unison Northwest and the Cuba Solidarity Campaign in Britain. And they're sending medical supplies like wheelchairs, blood transfusion sets, pediatric catheters, as well as food and the kind of things that we will be bringing ourselves. So we're part of this much larger effort, but we are aware that what we can do is really a drop in the ocean of what's needed. So the appeal really is to anybody listening or anybody who's following the situation in Cuba to really try and do what they can to donate to material aid anywhere close to anyone who is gathering material aid close to where they live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for laying that out. I wondered if you can tell us, we are also sending people as part of it,
We
right?
are. Yes,
yeah.
we are. Yes.
What does that entail in terms of being on the ground? Do you have any sense? I mean, I know that trip hasn't happened yet. It's imminent, but do you have a sense of what that will look like?
We have been doing some very careful preparation, but there's no knowing exactly what we're going to face on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
What I do know is, especially given that we will be staying with Cuban people rather than in a tourist hotel, our representatives will be experiencing what the Cuban people are experiencing themselves. So we're going prepared for total electricity blackout. Basically from evening onwards, having to rely on flashlights or other sources of electricity, not having access to drinking water, having every shop you walk into just be a set of empty shelves. Pharmacies are empty. Hospitals and medical facilities have no equipment. So that's what we're preparing for. There's also, of course, the unknown. The Trump administration could take action against Cuba without any notice, and that is a risk that anybody going on this convoy does face. But it is a risk that we consider worth taking in order to be able to bring some material aid to a country that really is that the Trump administration is really bent on destroying and starving it.
Yeah, it sounds difficult, very difficult. But I appreciate you laying out that this is actually a tiny drop in the ocean compared to what's really needed. And I think the Cuban government's strategy of not making more of an appeal for, international working class solidarity and instead engaging and wishing that somehow, the common sense of the Trump government, which is currently bombing people in Tehran and other cities in Iran, will somehow, prevail is a non-starter. Hopefully we can get more of a report back once this trip is complete.
I think the comrades who are going are probably looking forward to being able to report back from the ground what the situation actually is. And hopefully we'll be able to do an episode in the future with direct input from those comrades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll put the link to donate in the show notes. Donate whatever you can. Every penny, every pound counts.
It's not too late to donate. We are still, even after this trip, we are still able to donate any money that's left over to some of these organizations that do shipments to Cuba on an ongoing basis. So it's not too late, and please give generously.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Comrade. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep. And your vote, it ain't gonna stop.